One.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the reality show. Apologies for my face not being present. Hopefully, my beautiful mug will come onto the screen shortly once tech issues have subsided. Today, I've got Marco and Rich with me and Anders. Hey, guys, good to see you.
Yeah. And you, what is he?
Today, we're talking about a video that was put up by the UN a little while ago, but this is indicative, this video, I think, of the general attitude of the UN towards the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And it's very interesting for a lot of the things which I think we can take from it. And I want to ask you guys what your general impression was, but I think my major takeaways, what I think people should focus on in terms of the viewers, is culpability and causality, as in like what is in the video and what is omitted. And what's omitted is culpability and causality. Who started the wars and the conflicts that are going on and who is responsible for them. But what did you guys think?
Do you want to begin? I'll go do it. My impression, certainly, I'll begin with my first impression, which was, first of all, this is a cartoon medium. And I think that's telling as well, because it allows you to craft exactly the narrative you want, to start with whatever premises you want, to link through the subsequent steps in any way you choose, and to present a narrative that's predetermined at the outset. I think the title itself is interesting. It is the question of Palestine. And the questions I think people ought to hold in their head even before they start viewing is, what do they mean by Palestine? What is the question exactly? Where is Israel's future in any of this? Because Israel is notably absent in terms of its people and its nation in much of this video. It's just present in the background as some undefined evil a lot of the time, as we shall see. And that's hence the suggestion that this is really quite anti-Semitic in its presentation from beginning to end. So, and I think also, because it's a cartoon, I think you ought to ask, who has it been made for? What is the purpose for it? And you know, who is the audience for this? Because that will tell you a lot as to the level of critical thinking that is going to be applied to it by those that view it, and what their subsequent actions are likely to be having viewed it, and what impact that is going to have on an interpretation of the history of this region.
Yeah, this video is being made by the Committee for the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, which is another specific UN organization just invented in order to supply welfare to the Palestinians, effectively. As Richard said, why did I make this particular video, which was made incidentally in June 23, so 3 months before the events of October 7th, and what's the audience in mind? I think what I would like to draw people's attention as we show the clips is the kind of propaganda technique used in this kind of videos. First of all, the use of images. Second, the tone. Sometimes the woman, female voice, of course, or talks about the events. And the choice of words. I'll say something else about the choice of word later on as we look at it. But and as Morgan said, also how the lack of causation seems to be the main point of this video. There's never a cause, and often the passive tense is used in order to emphasize that things just happen, nobody's fault. When it on the Palestinian side, when it's Israel, it's always Israel that does something wrong.
Yeah, and to piggyback on what Morgan initially mentioned about things being omitted and what you, Marco, just mentioned, the fact that there is no mention of the fact that the Palestinians were multiple times offered a two-state solution and they always rejected it, they or their Arab fellow countries, and the fact that all the wars have been started or been the aggression of either the Arab states or Arab or Iran supported terrorist organizations. You know, so it's for those of us who are a little bit more familiar with the situation. I mean, it appears to be a total hack job in terms of the facts presented and the information that you're fed. But obviously, it's to Marco's point, production-wise, I can see that a lot of people may be taken in by this.
Yeah. I don't know, Daniel, do you want to play the first clip, or is Morgan still?
You know, I'm still here. Yeah, let's roll film, Daniel. If we've got it.
The question of Palestine keeps returning to our screens. But why? Well, it's an injustice and a denial of human rights that has persisted for over 100 years, with global implications. Here is a brief overview. After World War I, the League of Nations placed Palestine, formerly part of the Ottoman Empire, under a British administration that supported the creation of a Jewish national home there, a move that pleased Zionist leaders who considered it the ancient Jewish homeland. Amid increased immigration and foreign rule, Palestinians who had lived on the land for centuries staged an uprising from 1936 to 1939, which led to repression, including by British forces and Jewish militia. In 1947, the UN decided to partition Palestine into two independent states. Jerusalem was to be placed under UN administration. However, Israel declared independence in 1948 and captured much more of Palestine than the partition plan allocated, except for the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, held by Jordan, and the Gaza Strip, held by Egypt. More than half of the Palestinians were expelled from or fled their homes and ended up in refugee camps in the West Bank, Gaza, and neighboring countries. Palestinians refer to this as the Nakba, or catastrophe. They remain refugees to this day, mostly relying on the UN Palestine Refugee Agency, which was created specifically for this case.
Okay, so one thing that I think maybe I should say as well is just that there's so much in the video in terms of things which are omitted and how things are framed, which we might not get to all of them. But okay, so I have a few things to say, but Marco and Richard, what are your thoughts on this first bit of the video?
Yes, I couldn't go through the first 9 seconds without having, half a stroke, to be honest. The voiceover talks about the injustice and denial of human rights that Palestinians have been suffering for over 100 years. Like, Jesus, you're laying your point quite thickly, aren't you? Notice that the League of Nations placed Palestine after the destruction of the Ottoman Empire. Placed Palestine. Palestine never existed under the Ottoman Empire. Palestine was a term used by the Romans to define the area Syria-Palestina. Sorry, there was no Palestine placed in anyone's hand. Just the bits of the Ottoman Empire, which lost the First War, was given to one of the winners, Britain. So, then there is this use of the foreign rule over Palestine. Let's assume that we're talking about the term Palestine here. Let's use it. Palestine are effectively submitted to foreign rule. Why weren't the Turks foreign when they were part of the Ottoman Empire? Or are you just saying that the foreigners are only Jews and Brits because they're not Muslims? Who knows? And then the partition. Totally ignoring that in 1948 there was a UN plan that was given to accepted by Israel and rejected by the Arabs, and then when Israel declared independence, they were attacked by all the Arab states. Syria, Jordan, and Egypt attacked Israel. So the war didn't just happen to happen. It was caused by an attack on Israel, and the use of words like Israel captures land while Jordan and Egypt holds it, all this kind of incredible stuff, and the old use of refugee to these days. It's like, well, you escape a war once, and then you settle somewhere else, and the next generation are born in that new place, so they're no longer refugees. But
one of the things I noticed throughout this video, which I think is particularly telling when you consider who it's aimed at, what its audience is that throughout the Palestinians are presented almost as a secular group. I don't think there's any mention of Muslim or Islam throughout the entire video, if I remember rightly. But certainly very early on, we've established that Israel has been created to please, what's the phrase he used, please the Zionist leaders who consider it the ancient Jewish homeland. So clearly you're presenting the whole issue as though it's a religious-based state totally, and that's the entire reason for it. It's got nothing to do with individual rights or any of the stuff that we talk about regularly on this channel in terms of the moral case for defending Israel. And at the same time, it includes none of the religious, theocratically driven motivation on the Palestinian side or the Arab nations that surround it. In fact, Arab nations in the rest of the region, all of those other players that we know are frequently behind the scenes, whether it's Lebanon, whether it's Iran, are totally erased from this picture throughout this entire piece. I think one of the things you notice in the nature of the cartoon that is done here is when presenting the Arab revolt, which is not called an Arab revolt, it's mentioned in blurred writing in the background, but it's staged an uprising. Is all they do when they stage an uprising is raise a flag and hold their fist in the air. That's what an uprising is when presented in cartoon form. There's no violence whatsoever in that presentation of the term uprising, whereas later on we'll come to how Israel is drawn in the same kind of cartoons. And I think the out of the blue nature of these things, the fact that World War II is eradicated from this, and all of a sudden the UN has decided to partition Palestine. What did they hear the voice of God? I mean, it's ludicrous that you should skip that fact. And those are the kind of emissions that we're really talking about here.
Anders?
Well, I just would like to emphasize the 1948 and the fact that the omission of the war there, and then this massive Arab force that was attacking Israel. You know, and against all odds, Israel defended itself, and as a result of that war, yes, they took some more of that territory that the UN resolution had originally asked or recommended, and that the Arab nations and the Palestinians had rejected, and that's just such a massive omission that. I mean, it's so one-sided, so you can't. I mean, it's disqualified on so many points. This whole video.
And let's not forget, this is coming from the UN. Now, the way they frame it right from the off is a history of injustice and the denial of human rights, as you say, Anders, being one-sided. Now, the truth, in actual fact, is one-sided. We don't subscribe to this idea that everyone, both sides of every story, everyone's got a little bit of truth. But the UN's pretense is to be neutral in that way. And yet this video isn't neutral. And that's rather telling. And it's rather indicative of why they end up doing the things they do in relation to Israel. Now, I agree, the Arab revolt, I mean, it omits some of the ethnic violence, let's say, that's going on before the Arab revolt. But the Arab revolt is portrayed as if it's just a demand for justice, when the Arab revolt was a terror instigated by Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, later an employee of the Nazi government, in which he killed thousands of people, or instigated the killing of thousands of people, and thousands of Arabs who then had to flee it because they were terrified of that terror. So why is that not included in there for a single second? Then, as for the Nakba, which comes up just at the end of that clip, so the Nakba gets used, so I mean catastrophe, as the narrator says, gets used in two senses. The more literal sense is referring to the expulsion of the Arab populations, and that is fairly common. But note as well, they don't mention the other way it's used sometimes, which is the catastrophe, is the whole founding of the State of Israel. Now that's the more sly use of it, which gets slid in sometimes by the pro-Palestinian side. But they don't want to inform their viewers of that at all, do they? So when people are seeing the UN's actions, the fact that they can make and publish a video like this, expressing their view of it or their opinion, people just need to understand that the UN isn't this saintly, authoritative organization that they're treated as if they are. But there we go. So unless there's anything else, should we go to the next clip?
I just wanted to mention on that word Nakba just for a moment, that's the biggest font used throughout this piece. It's a giant word on the screen. This is the language they want you to learn so that you can insert it in your tweet when you send this video forward or encourage people to talk about it. That is clearly the intent behind this. It's an educative video in the sense that they want to make sure that the definition that suits the agenda here is the one used, and that's where the word Nakba is used by all those that parrot it out subsequent to viewing it.
Not least because one of the purposes of this, UN institution for Palestine is to actually celebrate stuff like the Nakba. Every year they have a massive celebration with events and speeches and stuff like that. And that's one of the points why this UN agency exists.
On the YouTube channel that includes this video, that includes a number of events from the 75 years of the Nakba, and all of that are presented, loudly and strongly on the screen. So it's very clear where their colours are coming from.
Anders, did you have something else to say?
Yeah, I just want to say, quite instructive to look at the list of members on this committee. You can just go to Wikipedia and get a list of all of them, and it's a motley crew of dictatorships and Muslim countries, and then there is a list of observers. So there are a number of countries that are observers, and well, there you have India and you have China as part of that as well, but notable absence of any Western country, Western in terms of Western Europe or the American or North America, and the closest you get, and I wouldn't hesitate to call it a Western country, but that is Turkey, I think.
And of course, a notable inclusion of South Africa, who we know full well from their ICJ role recently and their side in all of this.
I nowadays include them in the authoritarian.
Failed state, certainly, for sure. But yeah, absolutely.
Okay, Daniel, let's go to clip number 2.
In the 1967 Six-Day War, fought between Israel and neighboring Arab states, an additional 500,000 Palestinians were forced to flee. Israel occupied Gaza and the West Bank and annexed East Jerusalem, including the Old City. In the years following, the UN General Assembly affirmed the rights of Palestinians to self-determination, sovereignty, independence, and refugee return. In 1974, it recognized the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. Palestinians revolted against the Israeli occupation in 1987, referred to as the First Intifada, or uprising.
Yeah, so yeah, there again. So the 1967 war comes up straight away. And by the way, with this is the whole video sequentially. There's nothing cut out of here, just for people who haven't seen it. The 1967 war is the first bit there. And again, there's no reference to causation, who caused the war. There's no reference to Nasser in Egypt. So the 1967 war is almost like a natural disaster. Oh, this happened, and here are the consequences that Israel is culpable for, in the video's opinion. Which is just extraordinary. How on earth can you think about wars in that way? But guys, what do you think? So, Marco and Richard.
Yeah, the fact that in 1968 the UN creates the idea of self-determination of the Palestinian. I mean, self-determination, what does it mean? It's one of the biggest racist concepts ever. This group decides that in virtue of what the ethnicity or wherever they live in the world, they have the right to self-determination. I mean, they don't make the point they have the right to self-government, which could come from the fact that they are free individual able to decide how to organize themselves. No, self-determination, because the collectivist UN sees things only in groups. So a group has to have autonomy over another group. Because this is our favorite group. So, that's how collectivism works.
And of course, in that list also is the term refugee return, which we've covered again a number of times on this channel, and what that means. And if you refer back to what was at the end of the previous clip, which was there after the Nakba, that's where the refugees remain to this day. Now we're talking like an enormous amount of time since then. We're talking obviously generations after the initial group that left the country, and yet there's no sense of agency. There's never a sense of free will for any individuals within the Palestinian group. There's no reference to the fact that people have migrated all over the world and, of course, have had successful lives in all sorts of different countries. There's no mention of the fact that many Arab states don't want Palestinian refugees anyway. And of course, there's no reference to Egypt also, which I think we're going to come to in a minute more relevantly. But there's no reference to the fact that Egypt is part of the border of Palestine. It's as if the whole thing is bordered solely by Israel, which is one of those regular hidden messages that you're constantly being led to believe, particularly for those that have never seen a map of the area.
Anders?
I seem to remember, but correct me if I'm wrong, that the West Bank was once offered to Jordan and Gaza to Egypt to basically to claim as part of the country, but they didn't want it. And that goes back to Richard, what you said about the refugees, because we're talking about all these now, and I mean the number of refugees over the years has obviously grown because they marry and they have children. So there are millions of them in Jordan, and well, Gaza is basically a big refugee camp. So from the Arab states, there is no love lost on the Palestinians. I mean, their driving force is the hatred of Israel. And they really don't want the Palestinians, because if they had any compassion for the Palestinians, then they would have integrated them in their respective societies. And those refugee camps that that are basically grown into real cities in Jordan and elsewhere, they would have dissipated. But not to be conspiratorial, but I think that fanning the flame of resentment of Palestinians, you could believe that is actually part of the agenda. If they would be assimilated and integrated into these countries, yeah, they probably would still have the desire to go back to their non-existing homeland, but I think the edge would maybe taken off the whole issue.
I think the whole idea of the right of return does fan the flames of grievance amongst the Palestinians. I think that's right. And the example I always use is of Edward Said. So born in Jerusalem in 1934, lived a little bit in his childhood in Cairo, but was a Palestinian in the area, whose family were expelled because Israel. So the Arab populations in Israel, some were allowed to stay who didn't fight against the Israelis, and the ones who were a threat on the battlefield or were openly fighting against the new Israeli state were expelled. And his family came to Britain, and then he moved to the US and had a very successful life at the University of Columbia, became a very prominent English literature professor, creating all kinds of malign ideas. And his children, so he even once he had settled in another country and was safe, he was still considered a refugee. And his children, who weren't born in this area and never lived there, never owned property there. Because if we were to say there are genuine Palestinian grievances, there would have been people who would have been caught up, who would have been expelled from their homes. And that's an understandable gripe to have. But his children never owned property there, never lived there, and yet are counted as refugees by the UN to this day. And that is the way in which you perpetuate anger, resentment, grievance, the whole conflict into the further generations down the line. And I mean, the PLO will come up a little bit later, so I'll save my comments for there. But anything else about this clip?
Yeah, one more comment about the expulsion. And as you said, there were those who were considered a threat had to leave. But a lot of them left, if not voluntarily, but at least at the encouragement of the Arab nations, who said that you should leave. And this was back in 1948, I believe. And that's, I mean, a lot of them could have stayed. They own property in Israel, and Israel didn't threaten to take the property away from them. In fact, Israel is the only country in the region that accepts property rights in anywhere near to we consider being a proper respect of property rights.
And another way in which the whole idea of the right of return, it's framed as if there's still property there to return to, whereas either it was in almost all cases destroyed in the war or redeveloped over time. So even if, Ilan Journo makes this point in his book, even if there was a very old Palestinian now who had a key in his pocket to a house, almost certainly that doesn't exist anymore. So what are you returning to? You might return to the country, but there's no property which you own, which is still existing, which you have a claim to. There's no statute of limitations on these claims. Now, and I'll leave it there. Mark and Richard, was there anything else?
No, I think we'll save our fire and derision for what's to come.
Okay, let's roll the third clip, Daniel.
Intense diplomacy followed and led to the signing of the interim Oslo Accords between Israel and the PLO in the 1990s. Palestinians recognized Israel, and the Palestinian Authority was established to govern parts of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Further negotiations failed to resolve the remaining issues, as Israel expropriated Palestinian land and continued to transfer its population to illegal settlements in occupied Palestinian territory. During the Second Intifada in 2000, armed clashes and bomb attacks ensued. Israel built the West Bank separation wall, much of it inside Palestinian territory, seizing land and restricting freedom of movement. The International Court of Justice determined that the wall inside Palestinian territory was illegal.
So the PLO, for people not familiar, were some of the first Islamic fundamentalist terrorists on the world stage. And that isn't mentioned. Their crimes are not mentioned. And that, again, is conspicuous by its absence. And then, I'll just say this before I go to you guys. That wall, which they're mentioning just at the end there, is coming up, if my memory serves me right, in the context of the Second Intifada. Now, we'll get a bit more into the intifadas later, but these are basically, intifada means something like uprising, but these are like mass kind of violence against Israeli soldiers and Israeli people. And there were terror, like suicide attacks coming from the West Bank, which is why that wall, which wasn't all cement, like it's portrayed, some of it's electrified fencing and so on. Now, that's portrayed as a completely malicious thing to have done, when actually it's taken in response to genuine attacks and is an act of self-defense. However, just an indication of how the Israeli state is subject to the rule of law and isn't just given free rein to do whatever they like, as the video implicitly is claiming. That wall had a bit of a meandering path, and the village of, I think it's Beit Surik, I'm almost certainly getting that wrong, Razi's going to make fun of me later, took the Israeli government to the Supreme Court and won, because they didn't like where the path of the fence and the wall had gone, and the government had to respond to that. So Israel is a government and a country where even its government is submitted to the rule of law. They aren't just able to do what they want carte blanche, no matter how many people would like to state that that's the case. But what did you guys think about this one?
Yeah. Again, this is a particular. I'd like to draw attention to how they use the intonation and the images in this particular section of the clip. For example, the word violence ensued during the Second Intifada. Really? Did it spring out of the ground? Nobody was involved, just violence ensued, because we all know violence is sold in cans, and if you open it, it comes out of it. And then the use of the tone that she uses when she talks about the wall, like a wall sprang up, even in the territory, like things unheard of. Yes, because as Morgan said, the restriction of freedom of movement, as she was whinging about, meant that people were coming into Israel and killing Israelis and causing all sorts of violence. So, to defend yourself, you put a wall up. You're in a situation where you have these places run by Islamic nutters whose only purpose is to destroy Jews, to kill Jews, to destroy Israel as a state. So how do you deal with that? And then I'll stop here for a moment, but also the use of images like the falling bomb and all this kind of stuff, just pathetic, really.
I think on Marcus' point, to the point about intonation and tone, The moment when you get I've written it down as lightness and wonder. It's sort of jubilation she exudes at the point when she says that the Palestinian Authority is established to govern parts of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, as if this is a joyous moment, and that's the only light in the darkness of this entire period of history from beginning to end that this video is supposedly presenting to us. Marco mentioned the passive tense there with the violence, which is absolutely the case, and the fact that after the two, even to use the term intifadas, after those two, the wall is designed for Israel to protect itself. I mean, that's quite clear. But of course, remind you again that this is done in June 2023. This video is produced, and we know how prevalent in the discourse in politics walls are, whether it's hinting back towards the Berlin Wall or implying the wall between the US and Mexico and the Trump era or whatever. All of that is written into this. You'll note that the USA is only mentioned in terms of the picture of Clinton with the great handshake there. That's the only mention at all of the USA in this. Now, okay, admittedly, they could have gone harder and stronger against the USA and used all the other talking points about that, but they've honed this down to make sure this is totally a Palestinian victim narrative from beginning to end, and these poor people have no one to turn to.
Anders?
The fact that PLO was recognized as the official Palestinian representative is one of those great injustices of the last, of the Second World War era, I would say. And as you mentioned, Morgan, this is a terrorist organization that was responsible for the bombings in Munich, for the hijacking, I believe it was, in Uganda, in addition to all the atrocities it committed inside Israel and so on and so forth. I don't really have too much to add. I just second Marco and Richard in their comments.
I'd also say there's an unfortunate history of Western leaders, and I'm including Israel here, of pursuing peace almost at all costs and therefore making deals with terrorist organizations. I mean, I've got Ireland in mind here, but it isn't proper to make those kind of deals. Now, I might understand that Israel would have a sense of exhaustion about these kind of things, but even so, you shouldn't make these kind of deals. And it's not gained, Israel hasn't gained anything from making it, from the Oslo Accords, from the thing with Clinton and so on. And it mentions in the video as well that the Palestinians recognized Israel. Well, good for them for recognizing the self-evident. But what has that recognition achieved? Because the way that's brought up is, oh, look, here's this concession from them. They've recognized Israel. It's a real state. Yeah, recognizing the people who you've declared as your enemy, that's not much. And has it changed their behavior? No, it hasn't. Now, they may have engaged more in the negotiations during that time, but it's devolved into violence again and again and again. So what does that mean? It means nothing. And I'll just take our super chat as well. We have 10 euros from Christian Klein. Thank you so much. Who says, concerning the UN, years ago, I read Pedro San Juan's book, The UN Gang, a memoir of incompetence, corruption, espionage, anti-Semitism, and Islamic extremism. That's a word salad of a title, but he says he recommends it here for others. I'm always looking to expand my reading this. So I'll copy that down, Christian. Thank you. Anything else, guys, before we go to the next clip?
Yeah, so just to mention that after the 67 war, the 6-day war, Israel captured lots of land, including the Sinai Peninsula, which they return as a gesture of goodwill, showing that they're not the territorial grabbing monster that they're designed to be. And they're always trying to give up territory in order to reach some kind of peace, as you said, misguidedly, because you don't deal with this kind of terrorists. But that's what happened, and that's what's been ignored here.
And following the Oslo Accord, of course, it was the Palestinians who went back on the agreement and chose not to follow through on it when Arafat returned back home, as we've covered on the episode to do with the Oslo Accords on this channel, which you can also check out.
Let's go to the final clip, Daniel.
In 2005, Israel withdrew troops and settlers from Gaza. After an armed takeover by Hamas, Palestine's Islamic resistance movement, in 2007, Israel imposed a blockade on Gaza, which has caused a deepening humanitarian crisis, along with Palestinian resistance. Palestine became a UN non-member observer state in 2012, and a few years later, the Security Council demanded that Israel cease illegal settlement activity. However, settlements continue to expand. Despite broad international support for a two-state solution, it has not been possible to justly resolve core final status issues in accordance with UN resolutions. And that is why, until justice and international law prevail and Israel ends its occupation, we will continue to see the Palestinians struggle for their rights on our screens.
That isn't why we will continue to see their struggle on our screens. Now, it mentions the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza in 2005, where they forcefully removed every Israeli, every Jew from Gaza. Now, it's an act of enormous generosity, let's say, from the Israelis. I mean, it's self-sacrificial generosity to have done this. And again, I think signs of exhaustion amongst the Israeli population and leaders to do something like that. And what's omitted as well from the Palestinian side is what was inherited there were the now abandoned factories and greenhouses, like a large network of greenhouses, which they could have used and taken as industry as a new basis for an economy in Gaza. But these were destroyed out of spite. They weren't taken up. So the characterization of the Palestinians as people who are just crusading for justice and innocent victims who would make the best of the situation once they had it, they did not. And they went on into these elections, which were supervised, I think, by the EU. And the elections in Gaza came out with a Hamas majority, even though, in a sense, the Palestinian Authority won overall for the West Bank and Gaza. And then Hamas seized power. And that's why we are in the situation where we are today. And that's why the Palestinian struggle is on our screens. Guys, Mark and Richard, what do you think?
Yeah, this section is a bit of a hoops moment on it's kind of on goal from them, because when they talk about the Israel handover of Gaza and the takeover by Hamas, this Islamic organization, suddenly by accident you tell the truth about Hamas. Hamas, yeah, they were ruling Gaza, but you ignore the fact that they were voted in despite their very clear charter, destruction of Israel and killing of Jews. And also the fact that before Hamas became the ruler of Gaza, they had a massive war between 2008 and 10 with the Palestinian Authority. So at this point, there were two Palestinian governments at war with each other. So, but nobody ever talks about that because, Jesus, we don't want to make it look like Islamists are just murderous bastards. But, you know, we go for the line. And then apparently, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza has been caused by the blockade of Israel, who wanted to stop people from lobbing missiles across the fence. Oh, really? Because Hamas has got any causation for that today? They've been diverting funds for decades from the handouts that the West is giving to Gaza. They take the money, turn it into weapons, tunnels, and billions for their own for the leaders' usage. And the people in Gaza they're not starving because, as you see, you're never going to see a very thin Gazan in the area. But they use the money in order to oppress their own population rather than running the proper government is the way it should be.
Look at the omissions in this section of the video. There's no mention of the elections. There's no mention of the missiles firing across into Israel. Even the bit, there's no mention of Egypt, as I said earlier, in terms of there's a supposed blockade of Gaza. There's no mention of the fact that it's an Arab country that forms a part of its border. And of course, even at the moment when it's talking about the disengagement from Gaza, it tries to gloss over that in as few words and as quickly as possible. It's certainly not going to call it the land for peace deal, because that's going to sound far too friendly towards the Israelis, isn't it? So it goes for neutral language and tries to get over it as quickly as possible. And that's with an understanding, as Morgan said there, as to the altruistic aim there, and that not necessarily being the right thing to do. But nevertheless, even from an altruistic point of view, it's not mentioned. And neither, of course, is any of the humanitarian aid that's been poured into Gaza in its billions throughout the, the decades. There's no mention of that whatsoever. So anybody who's been supporting Gaza since in that period, you've got no recognition whatsoever for your effort you've supposedly made to lighten the situation. You should only feel guilty about it. And you'll notice how, however, is the term always applied to Israel throughout this piece. The voiceover will say something, and then they will say, however, Israel. It's always Israel breaking its word. It's always Israel breaking the agreed deal, breaking the rights of Palestinians. So it's painful to watch. It really boils your blood. You have to watch it a number of times without exploding, but yourself. But yeah.
Anders?
I found it interesting that they used the term Hamas takeover, but I assume that is just to emphasize and omitting the election, the fact that the Palestinians actually elected Hamas to rule Gaza. But so I assume that using the term Hamas takeover is to take blame away from the Palestinians and kind of increase the sentiment of victimhood or something. But I can imagine that when they put that piece together, that they had quite a bit of discussion, because you probably don't want to paint Hamas in a negative light either, do you? So
I mean, and my reflection on the whole video, there's a book I've got in the post on the way to me, which is a collection of essays by or edited by Christopher Hitchens and Edward Said, and it's called Blaming the Victims. Now, if you think about this video, victimhood is the portrait that's wanted to be portrayed, to be painted. And I mean, if you think about the bit with the wall, the blame is put on Israel for having put up the wall. And yet, of course, again, it's in response to attacks that they've suffered. I mean, next we'll have, look at them, they've created the Iron Dome. Why would they do this? They're shooting the missiles out of the sky, which are flying towards their own populace, right? So blaming the victims, indeed, except you've completely not misunderstood, but you've deliberately cast the perpetrators as the victims when they're the instigators. And that is the whole history of the conflict, which is obfuscated here, which is violence is instigated against the Israelis. They have to take actions in response to secure their own lives, to secure their country, and they're blamed for it. And they're blamed for it here by the UN. And this should stink to people of dishonesty or of one-sidedness, and a one-sidedness which is false. And so, guys, I guess, one, your general takeaways from the video, but then reflecting, how does this reflect on the UN? Like how the fact that the UN published this not that long ago, what does how we're seeing them treat Israel now? Because in a way, I see people on the Israeli side expecting that they're going to get some better treatment from the UN, at least for some of them. And yet, how on earth can we expect that when they're going to publish stuff like this? So Marco and Richard, general takeaways.
Yeah, before I answer that question, I'd like to point to the WOPA at the end. The Palestinians struggle for their rights, and then 3 months later we see their rights to what? To destroy Israel and kill Jews. Is that what you're really aiming at? But going back to what you're saying, yes, the UN is a rotten institution, but it's not a rotten institution because there's something wrong with the charter or whatever. It's a rotten institution because it's made of people. And mainly is made of westernized people who sit at the desk all day trying to come up with a reason to justify their own salaries. But even more depressingly, these kind of videos are targeting people vulnerable to the argument from authority. And why is this? Because we know most of the population are effectively taken over by a philosophy which you call skepticism. We see all the time. How many times we see the division of people into groups, and how you cannot understand the struggle of one group because you don't belong to the particular group. When the truth is no longer objective, is made up by your state of victim, and somebody else can make a different truth because they come from a different background from you. This is the natural outcome. And then you have this not belonging to the collective, and the collective status of it is also a reason why the individual struggle to find objective truth is actually replaced by the truths that come from your specific collective. These kind of skeptics, they will say also things like, yeah, the language is just a sort of convention that we adopt. However, as this video shows, they are very precise at choosing the words when it comes to their attempt to present facts which support their own side. They're very precise. They know exactly what a concept is and how language relates to concepts. But otherwise, they're quite happy to make the truth as flexible and malleable as they want.
I just want to say a word about, just for answer your question there, Morgan, about the cartoon nature of this, because that allows you to divorce everything from reality and to literally draw your own reality and make your own links in the visuals. And one particular example of that was when talking about the disengagement from Gaza. What image are we shown at this point when this most altruistic of gestures is made by Israel? We're shown a barbed wire fence, an Israeli soldier with a gun, a tank in the background. This is the moment of the disengagement. And then we see that the Israeli soldier lift his gun, and we hear him cock his weapon and point it. And that's to accompany the fact that they've withdrawn from Gaza. Well, there's an awful lot of intent behind that, isn't there? And it's sheer propaganda. At the conclusion of the piece, the voiceover says it's not been possible to justly resolve. And justly resolve, justly according to whom? Justice according to whom? It's not objective justice. It takes no account of Israel and Israelis throughout this in terms of their security, their intentions to live life. It takes no account of the death cult that Islam instigates within its people and encourages people to be martyrs for a cause and to worship death above life. None of that, of course, is going to be represented. But what makes this sickening is not the video itself, but it is who it's made by. And it's the fact that the UN at the end of it is still considered by most people as a neutral organization, as a sort of middle of the road compromise, the fairest way of judging between different parties is to go to the UN in people's mistaken belief, despite the fact that, as Marco outlined there, and in addition, the fact that there are so many dictatorships and dubious countries with equal votes in the UN, and it's literally a compromise with evil at every turn. But it's sold as a neutral body, as an arbiter, and that is the biggest lie of all. And that's what this video in that context is just jaw-dropping.
Yes, the cartoon allows them to get away from the reality of soldiers trying to invade and kill Israelis, doesn't it? Anders?
I think Marco and Richard wrapped it up really well. I just want to piggyback on the fact that the UN is considered this neutral organization. I think here in the US, there is a healthy skepticism about UN that I never experienced in Europe, where the UN is considered this, and especially in my native Sweden, that had one of the early general secretaries came from Sweden. So the Swedes have always considered the UN an organization that is beyond criticism, if you like. And I think the best thing that could happen, and this is again wishful thinking, is that the U.S. public would stand up and tell their representatives that it's time to leave this organization, and whatever they do that is good, which there are some certain things that are good, that American individuals, citizens, they can vote with their wallets what they want to continue to support, rather than having the federal government supply, I don't know if it's 25%, 1/3 of UN's entire budget year after year after year.
Yes, and I mean, I don't think we need to see this video to know that the UN is a corrupt organization. I think this is just further evidence for people to keep in mind for the context of the conflict. But as you say, the UN is corrupt from the off. Its whole premise is a premise of moral neutrality, of bringing in right from the start Russia into the heart of the organization, which at the time was still the Soviet Union, one of the largest killers of people in history. And for the UN to be putting out something like this, it just says so much about why they treat Israel in the manner that they do. And as for Palestinian grievances, although the Palestinian side, let's say, started all of this and started it again and again and again, we can find individual cases where you might understand why there's a gripe. If your family member's killed, it's understandable that someone's going to be distraught about that, of course. Or if you were in a village that was expelled, but you didn't want to attack the Israelis, it's understandable that you might feel hard done by that. And however, I was reflecting on, so the UN, as we said, are the ones who fan the flames of grievance and resistance or anger into further generations. And I was reflecting on this yesterday, just in the sense that I got back in contact with a friend of mine who I haven't spoken to for a couple of years, just because he lives abroad, who was a journalist, used to be a journalist. And 7 years ago, he was taken hostage by ISIS. Now, luckily, he was rescued and brought out and came home here to Edinburgh, where he lived at the time. And he was very, very poorly and had to be in hospital. And I was reflecting on, and I love this friend very, very dearly. He means a lot to me. If he was killed by Allied forces, the forces of the West, if he was blown up in that camp, I would grieve for that very, very deeply. But if there was this organization which was telling me that I should feel that resentment burning very deeply for generations to come, that would be an evil and immoral thing to do, because it would be a tragedy for Ritzy, my friend, to have died. But it would have been whilst the Western forces were doing something that was just, which was attacking ISIS. And whilst I would probably never get over that, if I was to take up the mantle of the UN's cause here and to say, yes, I'm going to keep my grievance going for generations and go out and attack Israelis or whatever, it's mixing context, it would be an evil thing to do. And that's what the UN does here. They fan the flames of that grievance and those gripes on and on and on. And this is just, again, another example of the way that they've completely vacated any claim to authority, which they didn't really have from the off. Now, we're just in the final few minutes. Any other thoughts, guys?
Yeah. I mean, the stuff, the continuous grievance is exactly the call for reparation from slavery or colonialism, all this kind of stuff. That's exactly what it is. As a friend of the channel put it, I didn't own slaves, and you didn't pick cotton. So, what's the principle of justice here? How is justice served if you're not the victim and I'm not the perpetrator of the injustice? Why should I give recompense for what? You haven't suffered. And then there is the whole understanding why the events of the last days have been reported the way they've been reported, because in these people's mind, the only standard of truth is in fact infallibility, is omniscience. It's only when you are when you know everything, you can then decide what's right and wrong. Well, that's not true. There is such a thing as reality out there. We have the faculty of reason, so we can learn and understand and know things. That's why we can objectively tell that Israel is the moral side of the story here, and the UN supporting people like Hamas and the other Islamic nutters who wants to destroy civilization are on the wrong side of things.
I think I would just stress that this is a 4-minute video, and we've played every moment of it across the course of this episode, as Morgan mentioned earlier. And as such, being a tight 4-minute video, this is a crib sheet. It's an executive summary for unthinking parrots to squawk out loudly and often. And its success is demonstrated by those talking points repeated in our social media feeds and then picked up by the TV and the mainstream media. And we can see how successful that is. And we can also see how, because this comes from a UN body, how the critical thinking that should be applied to it is not. And that in the kind of culture that we live in, where young people in particular aren't taught to analyze properly the source of their information and to use alternative sources. And of course, they're taught endlessly to trust a single body, particularly a state body, particularly an intergovernmental body, as being the authority on anything. And that's what led us to the point where so many are walking the streets in protest in our Western cities, in London, in New York, on the campuses. So this is what needs to be countered. Of course, tomorrow night we'll be covering the Israeli version of this video, the Israeli UN version of this video, except that we won't be, because it doesn't exist. There's no equivalent here. This is the only one narrative. This is the narrative that comes out of the UN.
Absolutely. Now, let's wrap up, just since we're in the last 60 seconds. So, Anders, where can people find your work?
You can find my work at andersingemarsson.substack.com or at thinkrightorwrong.com.
And Marco and Richard, where can people find your stuff?
On the sister channel to this, the Briefly Objective, down below in the description, and find it says for shorter content. You've got a link straight to it, where all the short videos that summarize and distill the points that are made on this channel and all of our major shows are given a bite-sized form for you to digest and take in and forward to counter the narrative you're hearing everywhere of the nature of this video we've just analyzed.
And you can find my Twitter and Substack in the description, Morgan Carter 98 on Twitter. You can see me having a go at Candace Owens for being a prize idiot yet again. And my Substack looks a bit sparse at the moment because some pieces have been taken down. It's being revamped fairly soon. But if you subscribe, you'll get that delivered just straight to your inbox as soon as that happens. But all right, everyone, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for watching. We'll be back tomorrow with the Daily Objective and the reality show. Bye-bye.